Welcome to Taking Stock, number 71. Those who take notice of what their ministers wear in and around church will no doubt have already spotted the hoodie I have very deliberately put on prior to filming this edition. For those who can't read it so well, it's a quote in Latin, painted in red, which reads Romanis eunt domus, but has been roughly corrected in white to read Romani ite domum, which means, or is meant to mean, Romans go home. And it's a reference to the famous Monty Python film Life of Brian. It happens to be on my list of desert island movies. But in case anyone ever creates that show, and just in case of the unlikely event of me being asked to be its subject, it shares top billing with Shawshank Redemption, Singing in the Rain, The Glenn Miller Story, The Great Escape, Goldfinger, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and Star Wars. There, that's my 8. But my favourite is still Life of Brian, and my favourite scene is still where the centurion corrects Brian's attempts at Latin, like a public school Latin teacher, and insists on Brian painting it up on the walls 100 times before dawn, or the centurion will, well, watch the film and you'll see. But where was I? Oh yeah, Life of Brian. It came out into cinemas the year Janet and I got married. I'd been a Monty Python fan all through my school years. When it was in its heyday as a TV programme, you'd find groups of adolescent schoolboys, including me, in playgrounds, common rooms, classrooms, standing around reciting, word for word, the sketches from the previous night's show. Our teachers indulged us to a certain extent, especially the more trendy ones. Hello, Mr. Heinitz. But after one particular episode had spent the whole time making a mocking pastiche of a documentary taking the rise out of the Cray twins, complete with an animated giant hedgehog, many of my contemporaries got detention for leaning out of classrooms in the echoey school corridors and shouting a long drawn out, Dinsdale! We loved Monty Python, and most of us then loved their movies, especially, I think, Life of Brian. So I was astonished around the time of the release of the film when I discovered a TV programme where John Cleese and the now apparently canonised Sir Michael Palin, were arguing over whether or not it was blasphemous, whether or not it should have been released at all, and indeed whether it was funny. And they were arguing with an exceptionally supercilious Malcolm Muggeridge, doyen of the Festival of Light in those days, and an old geezer, or so he appeared to me at the time, I was only 22, in a very purple cassock, a hugely flamboyant and ornate pectoral cross around his neck, and a massive episcopal ring on one finger, who spoke with a sort of exaggerated vowels and languid precision which can only be attributed to an Eton-educated scion of privilege who had been decanted from an Oxbridge college into the real world sometime in the 1930s and was still reeling punch-drunk from the shock. I believe his name was Melvin Stockwood, and he was a bishop. To be honest, Stockwood looked to be such a throwback to a Monty Python sketch which we had taken great joy in repeating over and over again to our teacher's impotent rage, that I spent half the debate waiting for the remaining Pythons to burst onto the set in full costume, shouting, "No one expects the Spanish Inquisition!" The thing is, to my, at the time, untutored ear, Cleese and Palin sounded eminently reasonable, and Muggeridge and Stockwood sounded supercilious, patronising, dismissive, and totally out of touch. I can't remember now, after 40 years, whether they were challenged on this point, but I seriously doubt whether they saw more than 10 minutes of the movie itself, but then spent upwards of half an hour or more treating Cleese and Palin like they were naughty boarding school boys being carpeted by the housemaster because they'd been caught smoking in the dorm by the head prefect. But they didn't quite say, "You've let the school down, you've let the house down, you've let me down, and above all, you've let yourselves down." But they might well have done, if left to their own devices. The reason I remember that debate, which wasn't really a debate, because Muggeridge and Stockwood weren't really listening to Cleese and Palin, is my astonishment at realising that two of what passed for intellectuals in the Christian community of the time missed the mark by so wide a margin that they doomed themselves to becoming, if they weren't already, complete caricatures of the kind of Christian which none of us wanted to become, not in my generation anyway. What they failed to appreciate was that the film managed to do what the Festival of Light and other evangelical enterprises had failed to do the previous 100 years before the film, and has still failed to do in various guises in the ensuing 40 years to a large extent. Get people talking about Jesus of Nazareth, his life and his teaching, and the events around his birth, his death, and we say his resurrection. I can certainly say that as an out Christian in my workplace, which is to say I wasn't an evangelist, but I didn't hide my faith, that film caused more coffee table conversations and dinner time debates between me and various atheists, apostates, anarchists and non-believers than anything the church had produced in decades. And yet here were self-designated representatives of the church trying their best to get a film suppressed, if not banned outright. Some Christians never learn, because what they did to Life of Brian in the late 70s, they then did to The Last Temptation of Christ, didn't they? Another film I watched with interest, having had to walk through a bunch of earnest Christians with protest banners outside of Bristol cinema. But how interesting that a film which dared to suggest that Jesus might have been so shockingly human as to have had, or thought about having, I'm not sure about the book, but the film's actually ambiguous, a heterosexual relationship with Mary Magdalene, whereas The Passion of the Christ, the Mel Gibson vehicle, which for over 2 hours shows in shocking, excruciating, almost obscene detail the scourging, the torture and the execution of Jesus, passed relatively without comment through the consciousness of the Christian community, presumably because it didn't challenge the received wisdom of the church in depicting Jesus or speculating about his life or purpose. I'm sure it's a function of age for all of us that there comes a time when we are no longer at the cultural cutting edge, so to speak, even if we ever were. That's a fact with which I am entirely comfortable, but for in my opinion there are very few sights more pathetic than a virtual geriatric continually trying to reinvent himself so as to give the appearance of being down with the kids. Even that is probably by now an expression of almost Shakespearean antiquity in the eyes of today's generation. Iggy Pop, anyone? But as a church, whilst most of us may be of our time, of our generation, we ought to be fostering new ways of looking at faith, new ways of expressing faith, even when expressed in a medium or even a language which we can neither understand or ourselves employ, or at least not with any credibility. We ought to be encouraging succeeding generations to discover their own ways of exploring and expressing faith, not dismissing or deriding them, even if we can't help but think that we've done all the discovering already. Who, after all, wants to become as frankly ridiculous, antediluvian and sneering as Malcolm Muggeridge and Mervyn Stock would be remembered for? Who wants to be remembered for doing a grave disservice to the God they profess to serve by embodying all the reasons why they had succeeded not in moulding God and Christ to their own public school authoritarian establishment image, but in making the church, if not faith, utterly irrelevant to so many people? God speaks in many ways to every generation, though through many media. We can try and suppress irreverence and humour. We can attempt to blunt the cutting edge of modern culture, but we do so at our peril. For as the writer to the Hebrews says, the word of God is alive and active and sharper than any double-edged sword. Stay safe, people.